Hello, good morning. My name is James J. This is week 3. It's Labor Day. Happy Labor Day. And I think I'll start out today with a poem by Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney went on to win the Pulitzer Prize in Literature. He's an Irish poet. He died a few years ago, but he had a long, tremendous career. And he started off in the from a farming family up in the north, and they heat their houses up there at that time. I think still do, but especially at that time with peat, right? So they'd be cutting with shovels or spades. They'd be cutting the turf up to heat the houses and that type of thing. It's a key part of what they did. And this is a poem about his father's work with the shovel, with the spade, and with that sort of choice where he had to make as a young kid whether he was going to follow that route on the farm and that route to digging and that type of thing, or whether also at the time there's been centuries of English violence and occupation in Ireland, especially in the north. And at that time in his life, there was quite a bit of flare-up of violence. So there's also that route that's out there. And then the other thing, of course, he ended up doing was taking the route of being a writer. So it's early in his career. He writes this. It's a young person that's making a decision about what they're gonna do, which path they're gonna take, and it starts in what the catalyst for the poem is. His father's tremendous ability to cut the turf moss, to cut the peat. So this is called Digging. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pin rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean, rasping sound. When the spade sinks into gravelly ground, my father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried a milk in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging, the cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pin rests. I'll dig with it. Seamus Heaney. So we'll kick off this week with a little Seamus Heaney. I received a few messages where folks were asking if they could get copies of the poems that I'd read to open up the previous classes. We did a Robert Bly poem, Kim Adonisio. Absolutely, I'll tack those on at the end of this module, and I can do that easy enough. I also found a link for Seamus Heaney from the Poetry Foundation that I'll put on the last part of this module too. And on that you can see the text of what I just read, as well as there's a quick little link that you can press to get the audio, and you get to hear his voice. He's got a great, wonderful accent. So it's nice to hear him too. And and his work is getting ready to be preserved permanently at the National Library in Dublin, and they're going to put together a gallery of well, you can go in there. I guess I haven't been there and it's being put together, but a gallery of his letters, all sorts of tributes to him, and how the pretty big visual component as well as an audio component, and it looks like it'll be terrific. A few years ago, I got a chance to see the Yates exhibit they put on, and that was just a hoot. So that kind of fits in also with what we're up to as far as with this class, with looking at different art forms and thinking about them as a writer and how a writer approaches different parts of the arts in response to those things. So it fits in with somewhat with what we're doing. Plus, I like that poem quite a bit, so I wanted to read it to you and start out the class with that today. Let's see, I don't have any particular announcements as far as events. Like last week we had an event with the welcome to the Writers Workshop program. And so we had that going on, but I don't have anything exactly like that on coming up. But I did want to mention that we do have coming up in this class a couple of pretty important deadlines. September 10th, Thursday, that first formal assignment's going to be due. You're going to be writing some flash fiction. right, in reply or in response to some of the flash fiction we've been reading. And then we also take that same thing that you wrote, you're going to be recording it, right, and posting it to YouTube, sending me the link. So you've got a writing assignment and then a recitation assignment. So those are pretty big chunks of points there, and it'll be our first time getting that writing done. I know that can be tough, especially in this format. We haven't had a chance to meet and have a conversation back and forth in a classroom like we normally would. So you're kind of making that leap of faith that you know how your work will be received and that type of thing. I say go forward, have fun with it, do your best. You've had all kinds of things to read and examples, and I'll talk a little bit more about that assignment today, as well as a little bit about that recitation. Before we jump in, I did want to mention some of the readings that we've done and pull out our flash fiction anthologies and get started there. So you probably just completed a quiz on some of the reading, so I'll address a couple of those things, and then I'll also pull up a couple things that I wanted to focus on. The main thing with the quiz is you've had, I'm sure you've taken plenty of quizzes over your academic career. You kind of notice that certain instructors are up to certain things as far as their style and what they're looking for in a quiz. Always worthwhile to note and keep track of that as a student, as a scholar. It'll help you out whether in this class or any other one. And one of the things that I'm usually looking for, you may have already noticed, is I'm just trying to direct you towards particular things in this book that I think would be useful to you as a writer, or potentially useful for your writing. So I want you to make sure to kind of slow down and look at those parts, and that's what I'm trying to do with those quizzes, to direct you towards those parts. Now, of course, there may be other things. I've described this book as a field guide. I mean, it has field guide in its title, but to think of it as a field guide in the same way that if we had a field guide in North American birds, and we wanted to go out looking for birds, we wouldn't necessarily read that field guide every page beforehand. Right? We might read it a little bit, and then we'd head out and we'd start actually looking for the birds. All right. So, and then as you find things, you kind of look in more details and hop around and kind of thumb through here, thumb through there in the book. So that's how we'll be doing it. And that's how we've been doing that. So these first few weeks, I've been trying to get us more of a introduction and overall sort of concept of what we're up to, what the flash fiction form is, these short stories, what we're, how they work, how they potentially work, and to try to give you some ideas for your own writing. As well as then with this last week, we pointed towards some particular examples with Michael Martone, the way that he talks about titles, and I think he has some great examples. And I mentioned also that he's I really like the way that he writes. He's a little bit goofy and is, I think, particularly inclined to listen to his language and the sounds and the musicality of what he's up to, and which I think is great. His example story, he's got those. He's got the so far of the short stories that we've read in the anthology. I think that his is the most disconnected in time. Right, it's not working in one linear stream. He bounces all around, and a lot of what he's doing is he's listening to what he was up to. He has one of those descriptions, and then there'll be just a kind of small element, and then he'll spin a whole nother section on that. A little small element, he'll spin a whole section on that. So he's letting the story generate its own structure, and he just seems to have kind of a natural playfulness, goofiness with the way that he looks at language. So I think that that's a lot of fun. On page 47, if you want to flip to page 47, I'll give you a chance if you need to get your book out. You can always hit the magic pause button, but I won't delay too terribly long because you can do that individually. So if you get your book out, page 47. I like how he describes titles as far as with messing with the titles. If you go midway through page 47, the second indented paragraph. For the prose writer, so the writer of fiction, right? For the prose writer, the title is as close as he or she will get to writing a poem. The poem loves to play close in the valence of individual words and their multiple meanings, sometimes contradictory meanings the words embody, as well as the lubricated surfaces of several such words rubbing up against one another. And then he uses the example from W.H. Auden, who was a great poet from the beginning and mid 20th century. And then he goes to the title, Poetry Makes Nothing Happen, and he proceeds from there. But I like that idea that he gets to, that for the prose writer, the title is as close to a poem as you'll end up writing. So that might be one way to think about your titles. They don't have to exactly make real literal sense, but they should be interesting and have a little kind of quirkiness to them, or maybe fragmented, or some way of looking at your story that gets the reader thinking in just a slightly different way than they would otherwise without that title. Typically, I write my titles last. Every now and then a title will come early and it sticks with me. But it's the first thing the reader sees. It's probably the last thing that the writer does. So putting that title on usually comes last. And sometimes I'll take pieces that if I've been revising, if I've got a short story I'm working on, it's a 500-word short story, and I might end up writing 750, 850 words to start with, and I'm going to cut it back down. So sometimes the title might be in some of those words that get cut off to the side. There might be an interesting phrase or something I liked, but it didn't exactly work with the story, so I cut it out. Putting it back into the title will sometimes be an interesting way to rethink or to add that extra layer. So experiment, have fun with it. You might want to think of it, though, as if you're writing like a little mini poem to begin your story. Also, I think it's funny, Michael Martone likes to come up with incredibly long titles in contrast to the short form that follows. That's just part of that playfulness, and I'd say go for it. Mess with it. See, fiddle. I like the idea of sort of fiddle with it, see what's working. So Martone is a good example if we think of this as a field guide to come back to. If you're having trouble with your titles or kind of getting stuck on how you want to move around, title is good. Also thinking about transitions, the way that he quickly goes through those, that he's listening to his story and spinning off of that. He is great for titles and I think transitions. So I think that this, as far as a field guide, I would mark that for those such things. So let's scroll back. Let's scroll a little farther forward too, and along the lines of details, we scroll to Vanessa Gebbie, page 57. Moving ahead, she has a whole bunch of details as far as thinking about kind of nuts and bolts. And I would kind of mark this chapter as a writer. I'd mark this chapter as if I'm also stuck in different areas or feeling like the writing's a little bit flat in spots, and I'm not quite sure how to jazz up my story without it getting real long and going off on these side tangents that I really don't have the space for. Gebbie has some excellent ideas, and one of the things that she notes, page 57, about halfway down, she mentions no weather forecast, and notice no weather forecast. How many stories do you read in which the first paragraph is a sort of weather forecast? She has in italics. She says, "It was a sunny afternoon in April," or "It was snowing and the wind was howling," that type of thing. She said no weather forecast, which I think is somewhat interesting and worth talking about a little bit more, unless the weather itself becomes a character, right? So if you're writing a sort of story, and there are all sorts of great examples of this, where the barren, harsh weather might become also another character or player driving the characters and their action, that type of thing. If that's the case, then use it, right? So if it's the conditions are particularly cold, particularly hot, these type of things, great. So use it. The weather becomes part of what keeps your story alive and interesting. If it's just sort of like small talk, you think about the way we do have small talk and kind of talking about the weather. If you were walking down the street and just talking to your neighbors, like, boy, it sure is a hot one today. Oh, yeah, hot one. These are fun conversations and good ways of making small talk with your neighbors. That's what it's there for. That's why I call it small talk. Short story, you probably don't have a whole lot of space. So that's a place that could be potentially cut. Unless it's really going to be part of a character, a feel, or a mood, right? So I wanted to clarify on that. I think that when she's saying no weather forecast, what she means is that you really need to pound for pound make sure something's working. Is it just superfluous, just extra information you're adding? If so, it can potentially be cut. If it's going to be part of the story, and as far as part of a theme or a mood you're setting in the story, then by all means keep it. If it's just a little extra small talk, probably can go. Okay? No, does that make sense? I'll sort of rhetorically ask that. I know that there's not exactly a way to reply, but I wanted you to take a little bit of time though to look through that. I think that's probably the most important part. She says it in these sort of absolute no weather forecast. Well, no weather forecasts that aren't relevant, right? That aren't relevant to your story. I would just add that little bit myself. So I'm scooching through. So I'm scooching through that, and moving into a couple other little things. That was Gebby. We did Martel and Gebby. Point of view. That was one of the quiz questions I had with that Tom Hazuka chapter. Point of view, of course, he's emphasizing how key that is, right? He tells a little story where he has the adult that the narrator, it's in first person, right? The I that's speaking, and as an adult has returned home, and of course, it's not the home that the narrator remembered, and that's the basic setup for that story. So that's a pretty short story that just gets a tremendous amount of information in there in a short amount of space. Kind of transitions off of Gebby's note on the weather forecast pretty well. So if we can scroll to that, and looking for Tom Hazuka here. That was on page 34, I believe. Yeah, so 34. So give you a quick little example, thinking about how point of view also is something to think about. Are you going to write it in first person? He says a lot of the short fiction that he reads is in first person. That's probably true if you think about what we run across and other sources that we'll get at for our short stories. It tends to be in that first person. Absolutely doesn't have to be. It can change a little bit. But this utilitarianism, I'm just going to read that first paragraph, page 34. I return home for the first time as an adult. That's right, so it's first person. The situation of the narrator has been set. My parents greet me traditionally. Mom worrying that woman isn't feeding me enough. Dad crushing my hand lest I forget which one of us survived Guadalcanal. And I love how he just packs in that first few sentences quite a bit of information so that we know that the parents of the speaker think about we think about them traditionally as far as the mother worrying about that, oh, you haven't eaten enough and that type of thing, and the dad with the firm handshake, but even the way that's described I think is interesting, crushing my hand lest I forget which one of us survived Guadalcanal, so we know that the dad's a World War II vet, and then of course quickly that's the setup in a few sentences, but an odor of arrested decay has replaced the smells of childhood. Right? I think that's think about that sensory, your senses and your perception, and that's a very vivid way to describe that things that aren't what you remember as a kid. Right? The house of my youth is decorated with death. So that's the opening paragraph. It sets up that point of view. It's first person. And it's pretty clear who the narrator is and what their situation is. From there, it launches into a pretty interesting short story with a lot going on in a real small amount of space. I think that's an excellent example of an opener like that gives you a lot of information, small amount of space. That was page 34 there. Let me see. I did the other thing that we ended up reading was Stuart Dybek. I really like his piece, and his main thing he's writing about journals and the importance of keeping a journal. I did the mini lecture last week on that, so I probably don't need to spend a whole lot of time covering that. But Stuart Dybek is as far as if I was marking my field guide for what I want to think about with that. I really like the way that he tries to emphasize for himself and for his students of writing that to think of themselves as a writer and constantly all the time having that journal. He has that great thoughts journal as he describes it. I'd mentioned in my little mini lecture, I don't know if that's a little bit of pressure for me, but just having any sort of notebook where you're constantly writing down notes, something of interest, something that catches your attention so that you have some of those details to come back to be catalyst for future writing. I think that's key. You want to think of yourself as a writer, and I hope that all of you do in this class. That's what, at least for the next 16 weeks, that's what we're going to be up to. But the idea is I want you to continue that for longer. So that's some of the readings that we've been covering. I'm not going to assign any particular new reading assignments for coming up for this week, in that we have the paper, the first formal assignment that we have. It's a big one. I want to give you time to do that, as well as I want you to record yourself reading it afterwards. So that's so you don't need to look in the links for any reading assignment from this. We'll take this week off from that. So the main thing I want you to do is work on that paper. Hopefully at this point you've got a draft. We're still about 4 days out from when it's due. As far as it's Monday, and as I'm recording this, so it's not due until Thursday the 10th. So hopefully you got a solid draft going. know what you're writing about and have gotten the words on the page where you can start working with them. The main thing is to get it out of your mind and onto the page where you can actually make things happen. So hopefully you'll end up with more than the word count, right? So you end up quite a bit over, and you'll be cutting those things back and have a lot to work with. That's generally what I end up trying to do. I used to write for a long time as a journalist for about 9 years, a column that was due every couple of weeks, as well as some book reviews and that type of thing. They all had some very specific word count deadlines, and they had to fit in the newspaper. So it was one of those things that the editor would cut anything that there was no going over because there was no space. That was great. It got me used to that focus. So that what can I cover in this word count? What's the amount? And then my game was I would figure out that focus, and then every article that I'd ever turn into the editor hit that word count exactly right on the button. And then every now and then they still cut stuff, so it might change around. But if you were to scroll through those 9 years of archiving, they would all be the same word count, just right in the money. But what it did is it gave me a chance to figure out focus. What can I cover? What can I cover? What's not going to fit? It's just going to have to be. A lot of times what I do is I think, I wish I could get more done. I take that aside, and some of those other pieces, I take that aside, and I'd use that for the next deadline, for the next assignment that I'd have. Which was great because I'd always have something. I was never having to go to the cabinets and it was bare, so to speak. So I was always able to keep going with that. So yes, what can you cover, I think, is key. Also, with that notion of every word counts, right? So to get everything down the page where you can work on it, and then polish from there. And let's see, so that's related to the actual writing of that as first assignment. And then the thing I was asking you all to do is to record yourself reading that. Make a little recording of that, post it on YouTube, and then send me the link. And there's from the module last week, there's the written details of those instructions. So I'm just kind of covering that in quick synopsis here. So you'll want to do that. And I think that reading aloud, it does two things. One, it gets a chance for me to meet all of you. And it gets a chance for you to meet each other a little bit, and that I'll take those readings and I'll put them together in a little YouTube stream, and we'll get a chance to at least hear and see all of each other a little bit, which I think is important as far as making those connections. But I also think it's a good habit to get into as a writer, to read your stuff aloud, especially when you're at the end. It's a way to get yourself revising, and your ear will sometimes pick up on things that your eye won't necessarily pick up on. So get your ear involved. That's the key part to revising. It's also if you get stuck in an area, if you're halfway through and you're not quite sure where you're going to go, sometimes read it aloud, and your own voice will figure out a way to push in a different direction. So it's a good revision tool. It's also, if you're stuck, once you maybe get, quarter, halfway, 3/4 through story, if you get that kind of dead end, you feel like you've written yourself into a dead end and you're not sure where your story is going to go next, it's a good way to get that going in another direction. So with the recitation component, and let's see, those are the main things. And I'm rolling through here, checking my notes for any other announcements. I think that's going to be about it. I will get those links up so that you can get a chance to see the text for the Seamus Heaney poem that I started out today with. Also the Kim Adenizio and the Robert Bly writings that we looked at previous weeks. I'll put those up for you as well. So have fun with it. I think that I'm looking forward to seeing your results. Hopefully this will be a good, fun opening assignment. I think it will be. And it gives us a chance to have a little bit more back and forth. So far, for the first 3 weeks of the class, it's just been me preparing these lectures and lecturing at you. This gets a chance for you to produce some writing that I'll get a chance to look at in a little more detail, and we can start that conversation. From there, I'll have a chance to, because I'll see what people are interested in and what they're really up to and want to work on. I'll have a chance to kind of retool and shift and pivot the classes as need be. At that point, I will start posting a lot of these deadlines far in advance, so that the next big assignment, writing assignment, our second piece is going to be September 24th, for example. You don't necessarily need to write that down quickly, and that I'll get that up on the assignments logs, and we'll get that in Canvas and that type of thing. But I just want to let you know so you can start plotting out how this is going to fit in with your other school classes, with your work, family obligations, whatever part of life and all those other things that you have going on. you'll get a chance to play, to see how those all fit together. So I'll get those assignments from you on the 10th. A deadline, right? So the 10th, I'll get those. It'll give me a chance to pivot a little bit and figure out what we want to do next, and then we'll really get going. And I'll get the rest of the semester sketched up, get it on the board, so you can get a chance to see how this all fits together. So you can hopefully do your best work in here as well as the best work you can in other classes. All right. Well, thank you so much. Email me with questions, concerns, clarifications, thoughts, all that kind of stuff. Enjoy those links to some of those other writers, especially with the Seamus Heaney. You can get a chance to, on that Poetry Foundation link, press that audio and you can hear his voice and his accent, and it's a lot of fun. Okay, have a good week writing. We'll talk to you soon.